A millionaire gave a poor boy a hamburger when he saw that he didn't have enough money to pay for it. One night, the boy frantically knocked on the millionaire's door because the town of Solvang stirred awake with the hesitant murmur of a new day. Its cobbled streets, a testament to Danish heritage, gleamed faintly under the pale morning light. The rows of windmills stood still, their blades silent sentinels against the sprawling hills. The air carried a subtle chill, crisp, yet tinged with the earthy scent of dew settling into the soil. Behind the postcard perfection of brightly painted storefronts and bakeries offering fresh pastries lay an unspoken reality. A quieter struggle lived by those whose hands never felt the leisure of idle moments. Among them was Thomas. His small figure moved purposefully along an empty alley, his worn sneakers tapping lightly against the pavement. His jacket, 2 sizes too big, hung awkwardly from his slender frame. The faded red of its fabric had long given up fighting the dirt, but Thomas didn't seem to mind. He carried a burlap sack slung over one shoulder, already half filled with glass bottles and aluminum cans. The clink of bottles added rhythm to his morning routine. He crouched near a trash bin, brushing away yesterday's crumbs from his hands as he reached inside. The sun peeked over the rooftops, casting a faint warmth on his messy brown hair. Thomas's eyes, wide and dark like polished stones, scanned each container he found with precision. It wasn't just a hunt for recyclables. It was a lifeline. With practiced movements, he wiped dust from a bottle and dropped it into his sack, the satisfaction of another penny earned flashing briefly in his smile. But the smile didn't linger. He turned his head toward the horizon, where a small, one-room rental sat tucked behind a narrow lane. The thought of home reminded him of Marilyn. Inside the dimly lit room, Marilyn stirred, her frail body a shadow against the coarse sheets. The bed creaked softly under her weight as she shifted, a hoarse cough breaking the morning silence. Her once vibrant complexion had been replaced by an ashen pallor, her cheeks hollowed by months of illness. The room itself was simple, its plain walls stripped bare, except for a faded calendar hanging crooked near the door. A single window offered a modest view of a patchy yard, its glass streaked with condensation. An old sewing machine sat in one corner, untouched and dusty, a reminder of better days when Marilyn's nimble hands could mend and create. Now those hands trembled as she reached for the glass of water on the rickety table beside her bed. "Mum." Thomas's voice, soft yet steady, broke through the stillness as the door clicked open. Marilyn lifted her head with visible effort. Her lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes betrayed a mix of gratitude and guilt. "You're back early," she rasped. Thomas nodded, setting his sack gently by the door. "I didn't want to leave you alone too long," he said, padding toward her bed. "Are you feeling better today?" Marilyn hesitated, her eyes lowering briefly before she forced a reply. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little tired." Thomas didn't press her. Instead, he busied himself in their modest kitchen, which consisted of a single countertop and a rusty stove that seemed to groan with every use. From a tin on the shelf, he scooped out the last bit of oatmeal, mixing it with water from the kettle he'd left simmering earlier. His movements were careful, deliberate, like a child playing house, except this was no game. He carried the small bowl to Marilyn's bedside, holding it out with both hands. "It's warm," he said simply. She took the bowl, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you, Thomas." Her voice cracked, but the words carried weight, a mother's pride laced with sorrow. As she ate slowly, Thomas sat cross-legged on the floor beside her, watching her every move. "You don't have to do this, you know," she murmured between spoonfuls, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas shook his head. "I don't mind," he said, his tone resolute. "You always took care of me. Now it's my turn." Marilyn's breath hitched, and she looked away, blinking quickly. The oatmeal sat heavy in her mouth, not from the taste, but from the emotion that threatened to overtake her. Thomas, oblivious or perhaps pretending to be, reached for the sack he'd left by the door. "I found a lot today," he said brightly, pulling out a handful of bottles. "I'm going to sell these and buy you some medicine." Marilyn reached out weakly, resting her hand on his. "You're too young to carry the world on your shoulders, Thomas," she said softly. "But someone has to," he replied simply, his gaze steady and unflinching. In that moment, Marilyn saw not just her 6-year-old son, but a boy growing up too quickly, shaped by necessity and love. She wanted to shield him from the weight he carried, but the illness anchoring her to the bed reminded her of her limits. Outside, the sun climbed higher, its rays filtering through the thin curtain. In that small, unassuming room, an unspoken resolve passed between mother and son, a quiet, unyielding promise to hold on, no matter how heavy the burden. The small diner in the heart of Solvang buzzed with subdued morning chatter. The clink of coffee cups and the low hum of the radio gave it a warm familiarity, though the air carried the faint scent of grease and wear. Behind the counter, Mrs. Rivera moved briskly, her floral apron stretched over a body hardened by years of long hours and short tempers. She had little patience for disruptions, especially on days when her arthritis flared. Thomas hesitated at the door, clutching a crumpled dollar bill and a handful of loose coins. The glass pane was smudged, the peeling letters spelling Rivera's Eats only half visible. He pushed the door open tentatively, the bell above jingling faintly. Inside, the diner felt bigger than it looked from the outside, its mismatched booths and scuffed floor adding to its worn charm. Thomas's stomach growled, a sharp reminder of the task at hand. His mother hadn't eaten in over a day, and his own hunger gnawed at him relentlessly. But he straightened his small frame, gripping the coins tightly as he approached the counter. Mrs. Rivera glanced down at him, her brows knitting together in mild irritation. "What do you need, kid?" she asked, her voice curt. Thomas placed the coins on the counter carefully, smoothing the crumpled dollar bill beside them. "A hamburger, please," he said, his voice soft but steady. Mrs. Rivera eyed the meager pile of money and let out a sharp laugh. "You think that's enough for a burger," she said, her voice rising just enough to turn a few heads. "You're short, kid. Go home." Thomas's cheeks flushed, but he stood firm. "I'll bring the rest tomorrow," he said quickly, his words tumbling out in a plea. "My mum's sick, and we haven't eaten—" "Listen," Mrs. Rivera interrupted, leaning forward with a frown. "This isn't a charity. If you don't have the money, you don't get the food. Simple as that." Thomas's small hands clenched at his sides. The eyes of the other patrons seemed to weigh heavily on him, their whispers a soft undercurrent to his growing humiliation. He swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper now. "Please, just this once." Mrs. Rivera waved him off with a dismissive snort. "I said no. Now, out with you before I call someone to—" The jingle of the doorbell cut her off. Richard Grant stepped into the diner, his polished shoes making a subtle yet distinct sound against the floor. Dressed in a tailored grey suit, he carried himself with a quiet confidence. At first glance, he seemed out of place in the worn little eatery, but his demeanor softened the contrast. He nodded politely to Mrs. Rivera, his expression neutral, as he approached the counter. Mrs. Rivera, taken aback, straightened her posture. "Good morning, Mr. Grant," she greeted, her tone shifting instantly to something more respectful. "The usual coffee?" "Yes," Richard replied, his voice calm and measured. As he waited, his eyes drifted to Thomas, who stood frozen, his small fists still clenched. Richard's gaze lingered. Richard was struck by the boy's oversized jacket, the worn soles of his sneakers, and the determined set of his jaw. Quietly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. "How much for the boy's meal?" Richard asked, his tone casual but deliberate. Mrs. Rivera blinked, startled. "Oh, well, it's just a hamburger," she stammered. "I mean, "I'll cover it," Richard said firmly, handing her a crisp bill. "And please, add whatever else he might need." Mrs. Rivera hesitated for a moment, then took the money with a forced smile. "Of course, Mr. Grant," she said, quickly turning to prepare the order. Thomas stared at Richard, his wide eyes a mixture of confusion and gratitude. He opened his mouth to speak, but Richard simply offered a faint smile, lifting a finger to his lips as if to say, "It's nothing." Then, without another word, he turned back to the counter to collect his coffee. The hamburger arrived shortly after, wrapped in wax paper and placed in front of Thomas. Richard glanced down at him, offering the faintest hint of a smile. "Go on," he said. "Eat. It's yours." Thomas hesitated only for a moment before taking the seat closest to the counter. When the hamburger arrived, he reached for it eagerly but carefully, as though it might disappear if he moved too quickly. His first bite was small, deliberate, but the hunger in his eyes betrayed him. Within minutes, half the burger was gone. Richard sipped his coffee, his gaze wandering the room, but always circling back to the boy. "You're hungry," he observed, his voice neutral. Thomas nodded, wiping his mouth with the sleeve of his jacket. "Thank you," he mumbled, glancing at Richard with wide, earnest eyes. "I'll pay you back. I just don't have anything right now." Richard leaned back slightly, cradling his coffee cup in both hands. "Don't worry about it," he said simply. "What's your name?" "Thomas," the boy replied between bites. "What's yours?" Richard paused for a moment, as though weighing his answer. "Just someone passing through," he said with a small shrug. Thomas sat quietly at the counter, the remnants of his burger scattered across its wax paper wrapping. He was still chewing the last bite, savoring it, despite the hollow ache that lingered in his stomach. Across from him, Richard Grant rested a hand on his coffee cup, his gaze lingering on the boy. The diner's faint noise fluctuated around them, including muted conversations, the scrape of forks, and the distant sizzle of a griddle. "So?" Richard began, his tone casual but laced with curiosity. "You've got a lot on your plate for someone your age." Thomas swallowed quickly, straightening in his seat. "It's just me and my mum," he said. His small hands rested on the counter, the fingers fidgeting slightly, as though trying to say more than his words could. "She's not well." Richard tilted his head, his expression carefully neutral. "She's sick?" Thomas nodded, lowering his gaze. "She can't get out of bed much anymore. I try to help, though." His voice carried a quiet pride. But there was something else there too, something weighed down by a burden too big for his 6 years. "And what kind of help does that look like?" Richard asked, leaning forward just enough to meet the boy's eyes. Thomas hesitated, glancing toward the door as if calculating how much he should reveal. Then, deciding there was no harm, he spoke softly. "I collect bottles. You know, the kind you can trade for money." He lifted his hands slightly, palms up, as though to show they were used to carrying more than they should. Richard considered the boy for a long moment. "It's hard work," he said finally, his voice even. "But you're doing it anyway." "Because I have to," Thomas replied simply. His words were straightforward, devoid of any trace of self-pity. "She needs medicine and food. If I don't do it, no one will." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. His eyes, sharp and discerning, took in every detail, the scuffed shoes barely hanging together, the jacket that drooped off his small frame. And then there was the boy's face. Something about it, the shape of his eyes or the way his brow furrowed slightly when he spoke, struck a chord Richard couldn't place. "Your mum must be proud of you," Richard said, his voice softening just enough. Thomas's head jerked up, his expression almost startled. Then he smiled, a small, shy thing that didn't quite reach his eyes. "She tells me I'm her little helper." Richard's grip on his coffee cup tightened imperceptibly. There was something about this boy's quiet resilience, the way he carried his world on small shoulders, that unsettled him. Yet, it wasn't discomfort that rooted Richard to his seat. It was an unfamiliar sense of connection. As Mrs. Rivera emerged from the kitchen with a new plate for another customer, Richard gestured for her attention. "Can you pack 2 more meals and add a couple of those pastries by the window?" Mrs. Rivera blinked, her earlier irritation momentarily forgotten. Sure thing." She moved quickly, her steps brisk with purpose. Thomas looked up at Richard, his brow furrowing in confusion. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice low but earnest. Richard shrugged, sipping his coffee as if it came naturally to him. "I'm not doing it for me." When the bag was ready, Richard paid without fanfare, his movements deliberate. While Mrs. Rivera bustled behind the counter, he took a moment to slip a folded $500 into the bag, nestling it between the food containers. As he handed the bag to Thomas, his expression remained calm and unreadable. "Take this home to your mum," he said simply. "It'll make her day a little easier." Thomas hesitated, clutching the bag tightly. "I don't know how to thank you." Richard finally allowed a small smile to break through. "You already did," he said, his tone light. "Just take care of her." Thomas nodded solemnly, his small frame seeming to straighten under the weight of his gratitude. He hopped off the stool, the bag swinging from his hand as he walked toward the door. Just before stepping outside, he turned back briefly, his eyes searching Richard's face. "Maybe I'll see you again?" he asked, his voice uncertain but hopeful. Richard gave a slight nod, his hands wrapped loosely around his coffee cup. "Maybe." The bell above the door jingled faintly as Thomas disappeared into the morning light. For a moment, Richard sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the spot where the boy had been. There was a tightness in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name. Something about Thomas lingered, a familiarity, a connection that felt both strange and inevitable. He drained the last of his coffee, the warmth fading, but the quiet buzz of something unspoken stayed with him. Solvang's streets called him back to his routine, yet as he stepped out into the day, Richard found himself looking down the street, wondering where Thomas was going next, and whether their paths would cross again. Thomas pushed open the creaky door of their small room, the scent of warm food spilling in with him. "Mom, look!" he called, his voice bright with excitement as he hurried inside, clutching the paper bag close to his chest. Marilyn stirred on the bed, propping herself up weakly against the worn pillows. Her pale face softened with a faint smile as she saw her son's animated expression. "What's all this, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice thin but warm. Thomas climbed onto the edge of the bed, setting the bag carefully in her lap. "A man at the diner bought it for us. He saw I didn't have enough money and just helped." His eyes sparkled with the memory. "He even told Mrs. Rivera to pack extra for you." Marilyn opened the bag, her frail fingers trembling slightly as she pulled out the food containers. The smell of the meal filled the tiny room, and for a moment, her eyes glistened with gratitude. But as she reached deeper into the bag, her fingers brushed against something unfamiliar, crisp and thick. "What's this?" she murmured, pulling out a $500 bill. Her eyes widened in shock. "Thomas, where did this come from?" Thomas shrugged, his innocent smile unwavering. "He must have put it there. I didn't see him do it." Marilyn stared at the money, her mind racing. "Who is this man, Thomas? Did he tell you his name?" "No," Thomas replied, shaking his head. "He didn't say much, just that I should take care of you. He looked kind, but sad, like someone who has everything but still feels alone." Marilyn held the bill tightly, her chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and unease. "Whoever he is, he's an angel," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. Thomas smiled faintly, leaning against her side. "Maybe we'll see him again." Marilyn nodded, holding him close. maybe. The sprawling Grant mansion sat atop a gentle hill, its white facade gleaming under the noonday sun. Ivy curled up one side of the walls, clinging stubbornly to the stone like a memory refusing to fade. The garden that surrounded the house was meticulously trimmed, yet it lacked the life that comes from care born of love. Inside, the house was silent, save for the soft hum of a grandfather clock marking time in the foyer. It was a house too large for one man, a house filled with echoes, but no voices. Richard Grant knelt in the garden, pruning shears in hand, carefully trimming the roses that bordered the lawn. His tailored jacket lay folded on a bench nearby, replaced by a rolled-up shirt and dirt-streaked gloves. Each snip of the shears was precise, almost meditative. Yet, as he worked, his gaze occasionally drifted toward the road, as if anticipating a distraction. That distraction came in the form of Thomas. The boy, his burlap sack slung over one shoulder, wandered along the edge of the property, his small figure barely visible against the estate's tall iron gate. Richard noticed him and stood, brushing dirt off his hands. "Thomas!" he called out, his voice carrying across the garden. Thomas froze for a moment, then slowly approached the gate, his grin widening. "Hello," he said brightly. His head turned toward the mansion, curiosity sparking in his eyes. He stopped, his gaze catching on the engraved plaque beside the gate. "Grant," he murmured aloud, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "So, you're Mr. Grant." Richard chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You can just call me Richard," he said, unlocking the gate and motioning for the boy to come closer. Thomas hesitated, but then stepped inside, his eyes widening as he took in the immensity of the garden. "This place is huge," he breathed, craning his neck to see the tops of the tall oak trees swaying gently in the breeze. Richard crouched to meet his gaze. "What brings you here today?" he asked, a trace of amusement in his tone. Thomas held up his sack. "Looking for bottles," he said matter-of-factly. "You know, the kind I can sell." Richard gestured toward the patio. "I might have a few lying around. Come on." As they walked, Richard found himself watching the boy more closely. There was something striking in his quiet determination, in the way his small hands clutched the fraying sack as if it were a lifeline. And yet, there was also a lightness about him, a resilience that spoke of hope. "Why do you drink so much?" Thomas asked suddenly, his tone as casual as if he'd asked about the weather. Richard stopped mid-step, his brow furrowing. "What makes you say that?" Thomas pointed to the pile of empty wine bottles stacked neatly by the back door. "You must drink a lot if you've got that many," he said simply. Richard blinked, taken aback. Then, to his own surprise, he laughed. "Maybe I do," he admitted, though his tone turned somber. "It's an old habit." Thomas tilted his head, his brow furrowing. "You shouldn't," he said, with the bluntness only a child could muster. "It's bad for you." The words hung in the air, disarming in their simplicity. Richard studied the boy, noting the earnestness in his expression. For a moment, he felt a pang of something unfamiliar, something he hadn't felt in years. Concern. Genuine, unfiltered concern. "I'll keep that in mind," Richard said quietly. Thomas nodded, satisfied. "Good. My mom always says it's better to be strong." As they reached the pile of bottles, Richard began helping Thomas load them into the sack, his movements slow and deliberate. The boy's chatter filled the silence, a stream of observations and questions about the garden, the mansion, and the towering oaks that framed the yard. Richard found himself responding, his usual guarded demeanor softening with each passing moment. When the sack was full, Thomas looked up at Richard, his eyes sparkling with gratitude. "Thank you, Richard," he expressed sincerely, the name effortlessly flowing from his mouth. Richard smiled faintly, his hands resting on his hips. "Take care of yourself, Thomas," he said. "If you ever need anything, You can always come here. Promise me that." Thomas beamed. "I promise. Maybe next time I'll bring my mum." Richard nodded, though his chest tightened at the mention of the boy's mother. "I'd like that." As Thomas disappeared down the road, his sack swinging with each step, Richard stood in the garden for a long time, the weight of the boy's innocent words lingering in the quiet. For the first time in years, the vast emptiness of his home didn't feel quite so unbearable. That weekend, the storm came suddenly, transforming Solvang's cobbled streets into glistening rivers under the flicker of dim streetlights. Rain pelted against the large windows of the Grant mansion, its rhythmic drumming a relentless soundtrack to the otherwise silent house. Inside, Richard sat alone in his study, the amber glow of a single lamp illuminating the room. A half-empty glass of whiskey rested on the table beside him, untouched for the last hour. His eyes were fixed on the flickering fire in the hearth, though his mind wandered elsewhere, tethered to thoughts he hadn't shaken since meeting Thomas. Then came the knock. It was frantic, uneven, and urgent, breaking through the steady hum of the rain. Richard frowned, his brows furrowing as he rose from his chair. Another knock followed, louder this time, almost desperate. He strode quickly to the door, pulling it open against the gust of wind that blew rain into the entryway. Thomas stood there, drenched to the bone, his small body trembling. His hair clung to his forehead, and his cheeks were streaked with tears indistinguishable from the rain. His burlap sack was missing, replaced by his bare hands clutching tightly at his soaked jacket. "Richard!" he cried, his voice cracking with panic. "Please, you have to help. My mum, she's really sick." Richard knelt, steadying the boy with firm hands on his shoulders. "What happened, Thomas?" he asked, his voice low but commanding. "She was coughing so much," Thomas stammered, tears spilling freely now. "And then there was blood. A lot of it. I didn't know where else to go." For a brief moment, Richard froze, his mind whirling as an old buried pain clawed its way to the surface. But the fear in Thomas's eyes snapped him back to the present. "Where is she?" Richard asked, already reaching for his coat. Thomas sniffled, gripping Richard's arm like a lifeline. "At home. Please hurry." Richard didn't need further urging. He grabbed his car keys and ushered Thomas into the passenger seat of his sleek black sedan. The engine roared to life, and they sped down the rain-slick streets, the windshield wipers barely keeping up with the deluge. Thomas sat rigid, his small hands gripping the seatbelt tightly. He leaned towards Richard, his wide eyes darting across the older man's face as lightning flashed past. "You'll help her, right?" he whispered, his voice trembling with both hope and fear. "I'll do everything I can," Richard said firmly, his tone leaving no room for doubt. They arrived at the tiny rental house minutes later, though it felt like hours to Thomas. The rain soaked them again as they sprinted to the door, which Thomas pushed open with trembling hands. The scene inside hit Richard like a punch to the chest. Marilyn lay sprawled on the floor, her body motionless, her thin nightgown stained with blood. Her dark hair clung to her damp, pale face, and the faintest wheeze escaped her lips. Richard froze, his breath catching as a thunderclap of recognition struck him. And then he recognized her. "Marilyn," he whispered, the name foreign and familiar on his tongue. His mind reeled with images from the past, her as a little girl running through the garden, her laughter ringing out like a bell, and the last time he'd seen her, shouting that she'd never come back. "Richard!" Thomas's frantic tug on his arm dragged him back to the present. "Please, we have to help her." The boy's desperate voice shattered the fog of memory. Richard snapped into action, kneeling beside Marilyn and pressing 2 fingers to her neck. Her pulse was faint, but there. "She's alive," Richard said, more to himself than to Thomas. "We need to get her to the hospital, now." With a surprising strength born of urgency, Richard lifted Marilyn into his arms. Her body felt impossibly light, a cruel reminder of how much she had withered in the years since he'd last seen her. Thomas followed close behind, his small frame shaking as he trailed them into the storm. The drive to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and the sound of Marilyn's labored breaths. Thomas sat in the back seat, his hands gripping hers tightly, whispering soft pleas into the void. Richard's knuckles whitened around the steering wheel, his mind battling the flood of guilt and regret that threatened to overwhelm him. When they reached the emergency room, the medical staff rushed Marilyn inside, leaving Richard and Thomas standing in the harsh fluorescent light of the waiting area. Thomas clung to Richard's side, his wet clothes dripping onto the tiled floor. For the first time in years, Richard prayed. The sterile light of the hospital cast a pale, almost ghostly glow over the waiting room. Richard sat stiffly in one of the plastic chairs, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Across from him, Thomas sat curled up in the chair, his knees pulled to his chest. The boy's small frame trembled, though whether from the cold or the lingering panic, Richard couldn't tell. The distant sound of a monitor beeping punctuated the silence, along with the quiet hum of voices from behind the heavy double doors leading to the operating rooms. The antiseptic smell of the hospital clawed at Richard's senses, grounding him in a reality he couldn't escape. Thomas shifted in his seat, his gaze fixed on the polished tiles beneath his shoes. "Will she be okay?" he asked softly, his voice barely audible. Richard glanced at him, the boy's wide, tear-streaked eyes pulling at something deep within him. "The doctors are doing everything they can," he replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "She's strong. She'll fight." Thomas nodded, his head dipping slightly as if he needed to believe it. He reached out tentatively and wrapped his small fingers around Richard's hand, seeking comfort. Richard didn't pull away. Instead, he squeezed the boy's hand gently, a silent reassurance. The quiet stretched between them, heavy with unspoken fears. For Richard, it wasn't just the immediate worry about Marilyn's condition. It was the years of anger, regret, and estrangement that weighed on him. The memory of their last argument replayed in his mind with brutal clarity. It had been 8 years ago, in this very town. Marilyn stood at the doorway of the Grant mansion, her suitcase by her side. Her eyes, so much like her mother's, were alight with defiance and pain. "You don't get to decide who I love," she had said, her voice trembling but firm. "And you don't get to throw your life away on someone who can't even take care of himself," Richard had shot back, his voice colder than he intended. Marilyn had laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "It's not about him. It's about you. You control everything. You think love is some transaction you can manage, like your business deals." "Because love without stability is a disaster," Richard had retorted. "You'll regret this." Her response was swift, piercing the air with a sharp edge. "The only thing I regret is being your daughter." She had left that night, the slam of the door echoing through the empty halls. He hadn't seen her since. "Richard?" Thomas's voice pulled him from the depths of his memory. The boy's gaze was fixed on the floor, his fingers still clutching Richard's hand. "She always says I remind her of him, my dad, I mean." Richard stiffened, the pieces slowly clicking together. "Your dad?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Thomas nodded, his small face clouding with an expression too old for a child. "He left before I was born. Mom said he didn't want to stay when he found out about me." Richard's throat tightened. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Marilyn had been alone all these years, raising Thomas without support. She had endured everything he had feared for her, and yet she had survived. And now... "She doesn't talk about him much," Thomas continued, his voice soft. "But she always says it's okay because we have each other." Richard looked down at the boy, a quiet resolve settling over him. "She's lucky to have you," he said, his voice low. Thomas smiled faintly, his eyes flickering with a spark of pride. At that moment, The doors to the operating room swung open. A doctor stepped out, her face calm but tired. "Are you Marilyn Grant's family?" she asked, her gaze shifting between the man and the boy. Richard rose immediately, his grip on Thomas's hand tightening. "Yes," he said firmly. "I'm her father." The doctor nodded, glancing at her clipboard. "She's stable for now. We've stopped the bleeding, but her condition is critical. You can see her once she's moved to recovery." Richard exhaled slowly, relief mixing with an ache he couldn't quite name. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady. As the doctor walked away, Thomas turned to Richard, his small hand still resting in his. "You're her dad?" Richard hesitated, the weight of the question pressing on him. Finally, he nodded. "Yes, Thomas, I am." The boy's face lit up with a mixture of surprise and understanding. "She never told me much about you," he admitted, his tone soft. "There's a lot she and I need to talk about," Richard replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But first, we need to make sure she's okay." Thomas nodded, his trust in Richard now absolute. Together they sat back down, waiting for the chance to see Marilyn again, the air between them heavy with unspoken promises of healing and redemption. The soft beep of the heart monitor filled the quiet hospital room, a rhythmic reminder of life's fragile persistence. Marilyn stirred against the thin pillow, her eyelids fluttering before slowly opening. The harsh fluorescent lights above made her wince, but it wasn't just the brightness that disoriented her. It was the sight of her father, Richard, sitting stiffly by her bedside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Richard's face was etched with lines of worry and something deeper, something raw and unguarded. Marilyn blinked, her dry lips parting slightly as though to speak, but the words caught in her throat. "Marilyn," Richard said softly, his voice breaking the stillness. Her breath hitched. "Dad," she whispered, her voice hoarse and weak. "Yes," he replied, leaning forward, his eyes scanning her face as though afraid she might vanish. "I'm here." Marilyn's gaze darted to the room, to the IV in her arm, and finally back to him. Confusion gave way to shame, her cheeks coloring faintly. How did you—" "Thomas," Richard interrupted gently, nodding toward the door where the boy had been ushered out moments earlier. "He brought me to you." Marilyn's eyes softened at the mention of her son, but tears quickly welled up as she looked back at Richard. "I didn't want you to see me like this," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I didn't want you to know." Richard's throat tightened. He reached for her hand but stopped just short, unsure if the gesture would be welcome. "Why, Marilyn? Why didn't you come to me?" Her lips quivered, and for a moment, the weight of 8 years of estrangement pressed down on them both. "I was ashamed," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "Ashamed of how things turned out. Ashamed I didn't listen to you." Richard shook his head, his expression pained. "You were my daughter, Marilyn. You are my daughter. There's nothing you could have done to change that." She looked away, tears spilling onto the stark white sheets. "I was too proud. After he left, I couldn't face you. I thought you'd say, 'I told you so.'" Richard's chest tightened, his hands finally closing over hers. "I don't care about being right, Marilyn. I care about you, about Thomas. I let you walk away, and I've regretted it every day since." Marilyn turned back to him, her eyes filled with sorrow and longing. "I missed you," she whispered, the words cracking with emotion. "Every day. I missed you so much." Richard bowed his head, his own tears threatening to fall. "I missed you too," he admitted, his voice raw, "but I didn't know how to fix what I'd broken." The room fell silent, except for the steady beep of the monitor. Then, slowly, Marilyn tightened her grip on Richard's hand. "You didn't break anything," she said. "I made my choices. I thought I was protecting my pride, but all I did was hurt us both." Before Richard could reply, the door creaked open and Thomas peeked inside. His wide eyes darted between the two adults, sensing the heavy atmosphere, but unsure of his place in it. "Come in, Thomas," Richard said, his voice gentler now. The boy shuffled inside, his small hands fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. He climbed onto the chair next to Marilyn, his gaze full of concern. "Mum." Marilyn smiled through her tears, reaching out to touch his cheek. "I'm okay, sweetheart," she said softly. Thomas turned to Richard, his expression uncertain. "Did you tell her about the diner?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Marilyn looked between them, confused. "The diner." Thomas's face brightened as he rushed to tell the story of how Richard had helped him. "He bought us food, Mom, and he put money in the bag. I didn't even know until I got home. I told you, do you remember?" Marilyn's gaze softened, her eyes locking with Richard's as Thomas continued, unaware of the emotional weight behind his words. "And he told me I could come to him if we ever needed anything," the boy added proudly. Marilyn swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "You did that for us?" Richard shrugged, his lips curving into a faint, almost apologetic smile. "I saw a boy who reminded me of someone I used to know, a stubborn, brave little girl who didn't ask for help when she needed it most." Marilyn let out a shaky laugh, wiping at her tears. "Still stubborn, I guess," she said, her voice lighter now. Thomas looked between them, a spark of hope in his eyes. "Does this mean we can all be together now?" Marilyn's heart clenched, and she glanced at Richard, her face softening. "If your grandpa wants to be around," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "then I think it's time we stop pretending we don't need each other." Richard nodded, his hand still clasping hers. "I'll be here," he promised, his voice steady, "for both of you." As Thomas crawled onto the bed to hug his mother, Richard sat back, his chest aching with both sorrow and relief. The walls they had built between them were crumbling, piece by piece, leaving room for something new to grow. The days following Marilyn's release from the hospital were filled with an unfamiliar sense of warmth and togetherness. Richard insisted they stay with him at the mansion, a suggestion met with some resistance from Marilyn, but readily embraced by Thomas. The boy's wide eyes glowed at the sight of the sprawling estate, eagerly exploring every corner as if it were a castle he had only dreamed of. "Grandpa, look at this," Thomas called one afternoon, holding up a toy airplane he'd found in the attic. The word "grandpa" had slipped out naturally, and when Richard heard it for the first time, his chest tightened, not with sadness, but with an overwhelming sense of belonging. He didn't correct the boy, nor did he try to mask the smile that spread across his face. The days were simple, but full. Mornings began with shared breakfasts in the sunlit dining room, where Thomas's laughter echoed off the walls that had once felt so empty. Marilyn, though still weak, often sat by the window, watching as her father and son worked in the garden. Richard had insisted Thomas help him plant new flowers, a task that left the boy's hands dirt-streaked and his cheeks flushed with joy. "You've got a knack for this," Richard said, crouching beside Thomas as they patted soil around a budding rosebush. Thomas grinned. "Mum says I'm good at anything if I try hard enough." Marilyn, watching from her chair, smiled faintly. She hadn't seen her father like this in years, unburdened, alive. The tension that had once defined their relationship seemed to dissolve in the warmth of these moments. But happiness, fleeting as it often is, can be abruptly shattered. It was during a routine follow-up appointment that the doctor asked Marilyn to stay behind for additional tests. She complied without question, though a knot of unease tightened in her chest. Richard and Thomas waited outside, chatting idly, unaware of the storm brewing inside. When Marilyn emerged, her face was pale, her movements slow. Richard immediately stood, concern etched into his features. "What did they say?" he asked, his voice low. Marilyn hesitated, her eyes darting to Thomas, who was engrossed in a magazine, oblivious to the tension. She took a shaky breath. "Later," she whispered. "At home." That evening, after Thomas had fallen asleep on the couch, Marilyn sat with Richard in the quiet glow of the living room. She looked at her father, her face calm, but her eyes betraying the weight of what she was about to say. "It's cancer," she said simply, the words landing like a stone between them. "Stage 4. They said it's already spread." Richard's breath caught. He gripped the armrest of his chair as if steadying himself. There must be something they can do. Treatment, surgery, anything. Marilyn shook her head gently. "They said the treatments might give me a few extra months, but they wouldn't be easy. And the time I have left, I want it to be with Thomas. I don't want him to see me suffer." Richard stared at her, his mind racing. "How long?" he inquired, his voice barely audible above a whisper. 4 months, if I'm lucky," she said, a faint bittersweet smile tugging at her lips. "But we both know luck hasn't been on my side." Richard leaned forward, his hands trembling. "Marilyn, I can't lose you. Not again." She reached across the space between them, resting her hand over his. "Dad," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tears welling in her eyes. "You've already given me so much. You've given Thomas a home, a family. That's more than I ever thought I'd have." Richard shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "It's not enough. I should have been there. I should have—" "Stop," Marilyn interrupted, squeezing his hand. "You're here now. That's what matters." The weight of her acceptance crushed him. She wasn't angry, wasn't bitter. She had forgiven him long ago, and now she was asking him to let go of his guilt. As they sat in the quiet of the mansion, their grief mingled with love, and they made an unspoken promise to make the most of the time they had left, for Thomas's sake and their own. And in the other room, oblivious to the gravity of the night, Thomas dreamed of roses blooming in his grandfather's garden. Marilyn sat on the front porch of the Grant mansion, her frail frame wrapped in a knitted blanket. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn, and the gentle breeze carried the scent of roses in bloom. She hadn't been here in years, and yet the sights and smells brought back a rush of memories. She could almost hear her mother's laughter echoing from the kitchen, or see her younger self running barefoot across the grass, her father chasing after her with feigned sternness. But those memories were bittersweet now, laced with the knowledge of all the time that had been lost. She glanced at Thomas, who was crouched in the garden beside Richard, his small hands patting soil around a newly planted lavender bush. Their laughter floated up to her, light and unburdened, and she smiled, despite the heaviness in her chest. "Grandpa, is this deep enough?" Thomas asked, holding up a trowel. Richard leaned over, inspecting the hole with exaggerated seriousness. "Just about perfect," he said, nodding. "Now we just need to give it a little water, and it'll grow beautifully." Thomas beamed, grabbing the small watering can. As he poured, a bit of water splashed onto his shoes, and he giggled. "Oops!" Marilyn chuckled softly, her heart swelling at the sight. Her father had always been so composed, so distant, yet here he was, kneeling in the dirt beside her son, his laughter genuine and warm. It was a side of him she had rarely seen, and it made her wish she had come back sooner. The days passed in a gentle rhythm. Mornings began with Richard cooking breakfast in the vast kitchen, a skill he'd surprised both Marilyn and Thomas with. One morning, as he effortlessly flipped pancakes, he said, "Don't look so shocked." At some point, even I had to rely on myself. "Pancakes are better when you make them," Thomas declared, his cheeks stuffed with syrup-drenched bites. Afternoons were spent in the garden, where Richard and Thomas worked side by side, their bond growing with each passing day. Marilyn often joined them, sitting under the shade of the oak tree with a book in her lap, though she rarely read it. Instead, she watched them, imprinting these moments into her memory. One evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed the mansion in golden light, Richard found Marilyn sitting by the piano in the drawing room. Her fingers grazed the keys, not playing, just feeling the smoothness beneath her touch. "You used to play all the time," Richard said, his voice soft. Marilyn looked up, a wistful smile on her lips. "Mum loved it when I played," she said. "She'd sit right there," she nodded toward a worn armchair, "and hum along." Richard's throat tightened at the memory. "You could still play," he suggested gently. Marilyn shook her head. "My hands aren't as steady as they used to be." She paused, her gaze drifting to the window. "But hearing Thomas laugh out there, it feels like music." Richard sat beside her, the two of them sharing a rare moment of silence that was both heavy and comforting. As the days turned into weeks, Marilyn's health continued to decline, but she faced it with a quiet grace that Richard found both heartbreaking and inspiring. She insisted on being part of everything: meals, gardening, evening walks, though her energy often waned quickly. One afternoon, as Thomas bounded up the stairs with a handful of flowers he'd picked from the garden, Marilyn pulled him into a hug, holding him longer than usual. "You're my sunshine, you know that?" she whispered into his hair. Thomas looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes. "And you're mine, Mom." Richard watched from the doorway, his chest tightening. He couldn't stop what was coming, but he could make sure that, for these precious days, Marilyn and Thomas were surrounded by love. At night, when the house grew quiet, Richard would sit by Marilyn's bedside, the two of them speaking in hushed tones about everything and nothing. Sometimes they laughed over old stories, and other times they simply sat in silence, their unspoken words filling the space between them. "I don't want Thomas to remember me like this," Marilyn said one evening, her voice barely audible. "He won't," Richard assured her, his hand covering hers. "He'll remember you as the strong, loving mother who gave him everything." Marilyn smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And he'll remember you too," she said, as the grandfather who showed up when it mattered most. The weight of her words settled over Richard, and he squeezed her hand gently. "I'll take care of him," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll make sure he's happy." "I know you will," Marilyn said softly, her eyes closing as sleep began to pull her under. Richard stayed by her side, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing, his heart aching with both love and impending loss. For now, they had peace, and he vowed to make every moment count. It was a perfect afternoon, the kind of day Marilyn had always loved. The sun cast a golden glow over the Grant estate, and a soft breeze rustled through the oak tree in the center of the garden. Birds chirped from their hidden perches, and the scent of freshly watered flowers hung in the air. Marilyn sat under the sprawling oak tree, her frail body propped up by a soft cushion. Thomas sat beside her, his hand resting in hers as he chattered about the flowers he'd planted with his grandfather earlier that morning. She smiled at him, her eyes taking in every detail of his animated face. The way his nose crinkled when he was excited, the way his hair shone in the sunlight. These moments were what she had fought so hard to hold on to. Richard watched them from the porch, his hands resting on the railing. He'd offered to carry Marilyn back inside when her breathing had grown heavier, but she had insisted on staying under the tree. "It's where I want to be," she'd said, her voice calm, resolute. As the shadows lengthened, Marilyn's hand tightened slightly around Thomas's. "Come closer, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice barely audible above a whisper. Thomas scooted closer, leaning his head against her shoulder. "I'm here, Mom," he said softly. Marilyn smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You've made me so proud," she whispered. "Promise me you'll always be kind, Thomas. Kind to others, and kind to yourself." "I promise," he said, his voice trembling. "But you have to promise to stay with me, Mom." Her heart ached at the quiet plea in his words, but she cupped his cheek with her hand, her thumb brushing away a tear. "I'll always be with you, my love. Always." The breeze picked up, rustling the leaves above them. Marilyn's head leaned back against the cushion, her eyes drifting to the canopy of green and gold. Her breathing slowed, her chest rising and falling gently until it stopped altogether. A soft smile lingered on her lips, as if she had found peace. Thomas sat still for a moment, gripping her hand tightly. "Mom," he whispered. When she didn't answer, his tears came in silent streams, and he curled into her side, clutching her scarf to his chest. From the porch, Richard's breath hitched. He walked slowly toward them, his heart heavy with the inevitable. Kneeling beside Marilyn, he placed a hand on her shoulder, his fingers trembling. "Goodbye, Marilyn," he said softly, his voice breaking. "I'll take care of him. I promise." The days after Marilyn's passing were quiet, filled with an aching stillness that settled over the house. Thomas often wandered into the garden, clutching his mother's scarf as if it held the last remnants of her presence. He spent hours sitting under the oak tree, talking to her as though she could still hear him. Richard found solace in tending the garden. He worked tirelessly, planting flowers that Marilyn had loved, roses, lavender, and daisies, each bloom a silent tribute to her. On the days when the grief became too much, he would sit under the oak tree, his hands stained with dirt, and watch Thomas play, his laughter a fragile thread that kept Richard grounded. One evening, as they stood together by Marilyn's grave in the garden, Thomas looked up at his grandfather. "Do you think she can see us?" he asked, his voice small. Richard placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his gaze fixed on the engraved stone. "I think she can," he said, "and I think she'd be proud of us for keeping her memory alive." Thomas nodded, his grip on the scarf tightening. "I'm going to make her proud," he said, his voice steadier now, "just like she wanted." Richard smiled faintly, his heart swelling with both pain and pride. "We both will," he said. Together they walked back toward the house, the sun setting behind them, casting the garden in hues of gold and crimson. The shadows of grief lingered, but within them was the quiet promise of healing, a legacy of love that would carry them forward. 1 year later, the Grant mansion was unrecognizable. No longer a quiet, echoing house steeped in loneliness, it now hummed with life and purpose. Bright flowers spilled from garden beds, laughter echoed from its halls, and a warmth filled the air, as if Marilyn's presence still lingered in every corner. Richard and Thomas stood by Marilyn's grave in the garden. The morning sunlight filtered through the oak tree, dappling the ground with golden light. Thomas knelt to place a bouquet of lavender and daisies, her favorite, on the smooth stone. He adjusted the scarf he wore, Marilyn's old one, now faded but precious. Richard stood silently beside him, his hands clasped in front of him. He didn't speak, but his thoughts flowed freely. "Thank you, Marilyn, for Thomas, for giving me the chance to be the father and grandfather I should have been." Thomas rose, brushing dirt off his knees. "Do you think she likes the flowers?" he asked, his voice light but laced with hope. Richard smiled gently. "She would love them," he said. "You chose well." They stood in silence for a moment longer, the wind rustling softly through the leaves above. Then Richard placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Ready to go?" Thomas nodded, but lingered for a moment, touching the gravestone lightly. "Bye, Mom," he said softly. "I'll make you proud." Back at the mansion, the changes Richard and Thomas had made were visible everywhere. The once quiet halls now hosted meetings for the Marilyn Grant Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to supporting single parents and their children. It had been Thomas's idea, inspired by his mother's strength and the challenges she had overcome. "Mom would have liked this, wouldn't she?" Thomas asked one day as they walked past the foundation's bustling offices, now set up in a wing of the mansion. "She would have loved it," Richard replied, his pride evident. Richard had transformed not just his home, but his heart. He spent his mornings tending the garden, a task that had become a ritual of healing. Thomas often joined him, his small hands now skilled at planting and pruning. Together, they expanded the garden, adding new sections in Marilyn's memory. One evening after dinner, Thomas turned to Richard with a thoughtful expression. "Grandpa, can we plant sunflowers next?" he asked. "Mom always said they were the happiest flowers." Richard chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "Sunflowers it is. We'll make them the centerpiece of the garden." Thomas grinned, his face lighting up with excitement. "Can we start tomorrow?" Richard smiled back, the weight of his grief now softened by the joy of their shared future. "Tomorrow it is." The next morning, the two stood together in the garden, their hands dirty as they worked side by side. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its warm light over the vibrant blooms that surrounded them. Thomas laughed as he struggled to carry a watering can twice his size, and Richard couldn't help but laugh with him. As they finished planting the first row of sunflower seeds, Thomas wiped his brow dramatically. "Do you think they'll grow tall enough to touch the sky?" he asked. Richard knelt beside him, his expression thoughtful. "I think they'll grow as tall as we let them," he said, "and with enough care, they'll reach higher than you can imagine." Thomas smiled, his eyes shining with hope. "Just like us, right, Grandpa?" Richard nodded, his chest tightening with pride and love. "Just like us." They sat back, admiring their work, as the gentle breeze carried the scent of lavender and roses across the garden. The mansion stood behind them, no longer a symbol of solitude, but of love, growth, and second chances. As they packed up their tools and began walking toward the house, Thomas looked up at Richard. "What should we plant next?" he asked, his voice bright with curiosity. Richard smiled, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We'll decide together," he said. "The garden is ours now." And as they walked into the warmth of their shared home, the garden behind them stood as a living testament to their love, their healing, and the legacy of a woman who had brought them together. The sunflowers would bloom, the roses would thrive, and so too would their brighter future. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.